Today, welcome. To the time of the First World War, the overwhelming majority of black people in the United States lived in the South, a remnant of the cotton economy of the pre-Civil War years, and then continuing through the sharecropping economy of the post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction era. But during the First World War, we see the beginning of a transition, a migration of what will literally become millions of African American people from the South to the North. And this migration called the Great Migration, carries with it the seeds of some tremendous political changes in the United States and changes in the status of black people in the United States. And so we are going to look a little bit at this Great Migration on today. The United States entered World War II, actually prior to the United States entering World War II, World War I. World War I began in the year 1914, in July or August of 1914, and went on until November of 1918. World War I marked the rise of the United States from the role of a world power to the role of the world power. And from 1914, when the war began in Europe, to 1917, when the United States finally entered the war, April 1917, almost 3 full years after the war had begun, the United States, despite the fact that it was not involved in the war as a partisan in the war, the United States actually was supplying a good deal of the agricultural and manufactured goods that at least one side, the British side in the war, used during that war. In fact, the United States had in 1913 entered into a depression, and it is the war that brings the United States out of that depression. You may know that in a war, the nations that are fighting are taking men who previously were farmers or previously were factory laborers and putting those farmers and factory laborers into military uniforms and giving them guns and having them shoot at people from another country who are in the same position that they are. In the context of that war beginning in 1914, it presented to the United States a tremendous economic opportunity. The British and the French and the Germans too, although the Germans did not benefit from American manufacturing, American agriculture. The British and the French certainly demanded American manufacturing and American agriculture. And that brought the United States out of the Depression, and it created a great industrial boom in the United States. Now, the United States had reached industrial preeminence by the 1890s. It was the largest manufacturing nation in the world by the 1890s. It was producing more than the British and the French and the Germans, the 3 next industrial powers. It was producing more than those 3 industrial powers combined. And this tremendous industrialization in the United States called for a great deal of labor. For many years, that labor came from Europe. Literally, 1 million people a year in the first part of the 20th century migrated from Europe to the United States in search of work. And so the industrialization of the United States was accompanied by a tremendous migration from Eastern and Central Europe to the United States. Hungarians and Greeks and Italians, Poles, Jews, Russians, all came to the United States in search of work. When World War I began, you had the booming of American industry and the demand for labor to staff the factories of the United States, but the war itself cut off the migration from Europe. And as a result, you had this tremendous demand for labor being unable to be satisfied from places that previously had been providing that labor. In this context, American industry began to search for other laborers. And one of the prime sources of labor would be the American South and the black population of the American South. Let's give you some statistics. In 1914, 1.2 million immigrants poured into the United States from Europe. That dropped to 326,000 immigrants in 1915, 100,000 in 1916 and 17, and just over 100,000 in 1918. So from 1 million or over 1 million in 1914, the number of immigrants coming to the United States from Europe declined rapidly to a quarter and then a tenth of what it had been. Moreover, during that same period of time, a lot of these Europeans, the Greeks, Italians, Russians, left the United States and returned to their homelands in order to fight in the war that was raging in Europe. Now, on top of all of this, the United States military, as of 1917, when the United States involved itself in the war, had to draft 4 million Americans to serve in the U.S. military. And the result, as I say, was a tremendous demand for labor in the face of declining supplies for labor, and it is the black population of the United States that answers the call here. Now, black people had migrated from the rural areas of the South to the urban areas of the South, and had migrated from the South to the North prior to 1914, but the numbers were much more limited than what begins in this era of the First World War. So from 1890 to 1910, African Americans living in urban areas in the South increased from about a seventh, I think, of the population to a fifth of the population, of the black population. So just about 1 in every 5 African American people lived in an urban area, mostly in the South, by 1910. From 1870 to 1890, 20 years, 156,000 African American people moved from the South to the North. In the 1890s, with the intensification of segregation and with the violence that accompanied that intensification, the lynchings and the terror that was waged against black people, in that single decade, as many as 185,000 African Americans fled the South for the North. But this is a small change relative to the number of black people who migrate during the First World War and during the decade of the 1920s. Just in 3 years, 1916 to 1919, 1/2 million African Americans left the South and northern cities. So in the whole decade of the 1890s, less than 200,000, and in 3 years, over or about 500,000 people migrated. Nearly 1 million more African Americans followed during the decade of the 1920s. And then we have some specific black populations in specific cities growing significantly. Detroit grows, what, 7 times over, from 6,000 to 41,000. And these are the urban areas. These are the industrial cities of the north that we see growing so rapidly. I'm going to sign off now, and I'll continue in the next segment of this lecture.